Welcome to The Problem of the Piccadilly Poisoner, a Sherlock Holmes adventure from the series The Feminine Mystique, Sherlock Holmes and the Women of Baker Street, playing in the year 1897. It was only recently, during a clearing of the old attic at 221B, that a trunk was unearthed, filled not with my own chronicles, but with the private diaries and letters of the very women who shaped our most perplexing cases. These accounts reveal how, in an age of profound social change, Holmes and I were challenged by women who defied every convention, forcing us to see justice in an entirely new light. Let us begin, then, with the first of these remarkable testaments. I present to you the singular case I have come to call The Problem of the Piccadilly Poisoner, Chapter 1. Among the many chronicles of my friend Mr. Sherlock Holmes's singular faculties, few began with so humble a herald as the case I have chosen to call The Problem of the Piccadilly Poisoner. My notes lie before me now, supplemented by a small cloth-bound diary. It is to the author of that diary, Miss Clara Perkins, a woman of remarkably clear and resolute hand, that the credit belongs, for without her courage a most sinister affair might have been dismissed as little more than a passing feminine complaint. The affair commenced on a Tuesday in November, an evening of such persistent drizzling rain that the gas lamps along Baker Street cast only a weak and smudged glow upon the slick cobblestones. Within the comforting warmth of our lodgings at 221B, the world outside seemed a distant rumour, punctuated only by the hiss of the fire and the steady ticking of the clock upon the mantelpiece. Holmes had been in one of his black moods, pacing before the hearth like a caged tiger, when a hesitant knock sounded at our door. It was a sound too timid for a client in dire straits, yet too determined for a mere tradesman. A moment later, Mrs. Hudson showed in a young woman, her shawl damp with mist, her face pale but composed. She was dressed simply, in the dark, practical attire of a shopgirl, and she clutched a small reticule as if it were a shield. "Pray, take a seat by the fire, madam. You have come from a place of commerce, I see, and have walked some distance to reach us," Sherlock Holmes said. His voice was gentle, yet his eyes, sharp and analytic, missed nothing. The young woman started slightly, her gaze flicking down at her own worn but well-kept boots. "I have, sir. My name is Clara Perkins. I work in the drapery department at Harrods. I was told you were the man to consult when all others have failed," Miss Clara Perkins answered. Her voice was low but clear, though an undercurrent of strain betrayed a carefully managed anxiety. Holmes ceased his pacing and settled into his armchair, his expression shifting from bored indolence to one of keen professional interest. "I am he. And what is the trouble at Harrods, Miss Perkins? Has some bolt of silk gone missing?" declared Sherlock Holmes. "It is not a theft, Mr. Holmes. It is an illness, a strange ailment that has befallen at least a dozen of the girls in the past month. We suffer from debilitating headaches, a constant weariness, and a peculiar bitter taste that lingers for hours," replied Miss Clara Perkins. My medical instincts piqued. I leaned forward. "Have you consulted a physician? Surely the store employs one," remarked Dr. John Watson. "We have, doctor. He and the general manager, Mr. Grantham, have declared it a bout of feminine hysteria, a shared delusion brought on by the pressures of the season," Miss Clara Perkins answered. Her voice trembled with a sudden sharp indignation. The effect of this diagnosis on my friend was electric. Holmes sat bolt upright, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, a dangerous glint in his grey eyes. Hysteria, the last refuge of the diagnostically destitute. When a dozen people in a shared environment report identical and specific physical symptoms, Watson, it is the height of folly to seek the cause in the mind rather than in the kitchen. It suggests not a shared delusion, but a shared substance. The management's desire to dismiss it is, to me, the most singular feature of the entire affair, stated Sherlock Holmes. Miss Perkins let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for weeks. For the first time, a flicker of hope illuminated her tired features. Holmes leaned towards her. His voice dropped to a low, intense pitch, vibrating with newfound energy. Tell me, Miss Perkins, this bitter taste you mentioned, does it seem most pronounced after your afternoon refreshment? Sherlock Holmes said. Miss Clara Perkins finished her account and sat quite still in the client's chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, a stark figure of resolve against the cluttered backdrop of our Baker Street sitting-room. Outside, a persistent November drizzle slicked the cobblestones, and the rhythmic clip-clop of a hansom cab's horse faded into the grey afternoon. Holmes, who had risen during her tale, now stood before the fireplace, his back to us, his tall, gaunt frame silhouetted against the flickering flames. Feminine hysteria. It is a diagnosis of remarkable convenience, is it not, Watson? A label applied by the unimaginative to that which they cannot be bothered to understand, replied Sherlock Holmes. He turned on his heel, his grey eyes alight with that peculiar fire I knew so well, the look that signalled the game was afoot. He fixed his gaze upon Miss Perkins, his expression softening from its usual piercing intensity to one of genuine intellectual curiosity. They are wrong, Miss Perkins, utterly and completely wrong. This is not some phantom of the feminine constitution. It is a pattern, and where there is a pattern, there is a design. A design, sir, replied Miss Clara Perkins. Her voice was scarcely more than a whisper, yet it carried a note of profound relief. For the first time she was being heard not with condescension, but with serious attention. Indeed, consider the facts you have so admirably laid before us. The victims are all from the same department. The symptoms manifest shortly after the midday break. The malaise is consistent. Dizziness, nausea, a bitter taste. Hysteria is chaotic. This is methodical. This is poison, explained Sherlock Holmes. The word hung in the air, heavy and oppressive, like the fog gathering outside our windows. Miss Perkins visibly flinched, but her eyes did not waver from Holmes's face. But, Holmes, the symptoms are so mild. Surely, if it were poison, Dr. John Watson commented. A small dose, Watson, a subtle agent, intended perhaps not to kill, but to disable, to distress, to drive these young women from their employment. The motive is as yet a shadow, but the method begins to take shape. Therefore, Miss Perkins, I will take your case, Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial tone that seemed to draw the very shadows of the room in closer around us. Your sisterhood will now serve a new purpose. They are to be my eyes and my ears within the walls of Harrods. They are to observe everything, every slight, every argument, every deviation from the daily routine. But I require more than observation. I require evidence, stated Sherlock Holmes. What must we do, Mr. Holmes? We will do anything, said Miss Clara Perkins. The next time one of your colleagues falls ill, you must act swiftly and with the utmost discretion. You will secure the teacup from which she was drinking. Do not rinse it. Do not allow anyone else to handle it. Wrap it carefully in a piece of oilskin or thick paper, and have it delivered here to me without delay. Is that clear? Observed Sherlock Holmes. As glass, sir. We will not fail you, answered Miss Clara Perkins. Her voice was firm now, strengthened by a new-found purpose. After a few more words of instruction, I showed her out. I heard her light footsteps descending the 17 stairs, followed by the solid click of the front door closing against the damp evening air. As I returned to our rooms, my mind occupied with the quiet determination of our client, I found Holmes already filling a pipe, a thoughtful frown upon his brow. An audacious plan, Holmes, to use the shopgirls themselves as your agents, remarked Dr. John Watson. Who better, my dear fellow? They are invisible to those in power, and in their invisibility lies their strength. However, our internal investigation will only take us so far. We must also rattle the cage from the outside, stated Sherlock Holmes. He drew a long ribbon of blue smoke from his pipe, watching it curl towards the ceiling. Tomorrow morning, Watson, you will accompany me. We are going to pay a visit to the Emperor of Knightsbridge himself, the store's general manager, a Mr. Josiah Grantham. I suspect he will be far less cooperative than our admirable Miss Perkins, stated Sherlock Holmes. Following Holmes's declaration of a direct assault upon the citadel, the next morning we navigated the throng of hansom cabs on Brompton Road, bound for Harrods. A river of humanity flowed through its grand doors into air thick with expensive perfumes, new leather, and polished mahogany. The low murmur of 1,000 transactions hummed, the very heartbeat of the place, punctuated by the rustle of silk and the sharp click of heels on marble. Presenting Holmes's card, we were led upwards through a labyrinth of departments to a heavy oak door bearing a simple brass plate. Mr. Josiah Grantham, General Manager. The office within was as imposing as its occupant, Mr. Grantham himself. Tall and severe, with a perfectly trimmed beard, his eyes assessed us as he might a column of figures in a ledger. The room itself was a fortress of order, its silence broken only by the methodical tick of a grand clock. His voice, when he finally spoke, was as crisp and starched as his collar. "Mr. Holmes, I was informed of your impending visit. To what do I owe this unexpected intrusion into my business day?" said Mr. Josiah Grantham. "A matter of health, Mr. Grantham, specifically the health of several young women in your employ," remarked Sherlock Holmes. A flicker of annoyance crossed the manager's face. He waved a dismissive hand, the gesture sharp and final. "Ah, yes, the fainting spells. A seasonal affliction, I assure you. The weaker sex is prone to such vapours and hysterics, particularly in the city heat. A trifle, Mr. Holmes, and certainly not a matter for a man of your particular talents." "A trifle that has formed a most curious pattern," Holmes countered, his tone deceptively mild. "One that suggests a common cause beyond the supposed frailties of womanhood," replied Sherlock Holmes. Grantham's jaw tightened. He rose from his chair and paced to the window, his footsteps echoing softly on the Persian rug. The silence stretched, broken only by the clock's relentless march. He turned back, his voice now edged with steel. "My concern, sir, is for the reputation of this establishment. Harrods is a symbol of quality and trust. Whispers of illness, of mystery, they are a contagion I will not tolerate. The matter is being handled internally. The girls are being attended to. Your services are not required," replied Mr. Josiah Grantham. Holmes's eyes, however, were not on Grantham, but on the man's immaculate desk. I saw nothing of interest, yet my friend's gaze was fixed upon the blotter. "You take a remarkably personal interest in the mundane affairs of the store, do you not, Mr. Grantham? I see from the faint, reversed impression on your blotter that you have recently been reviewing the inventory manifests for the staff canteen, specifically the sourcing of bulk tea. An unusual preoccupation for a general manager, unless, of course, the tea itself has become a source of anxiety." Grantham's composure cracked. For a brief second, a look of pure fury contorted his features before being smoothed away into a mask of cold authority. He spoke through clenched teeth, his voice a low growl. "I am a thorough man, Mr. Holmes. That is all. Now, I must ask you to leave. You will not speak to my staff. You will not set foot on my shop floor again without a warrant. Is that understood?" Mr. Josiah Grantham said. The dismissal was absolute. We were ushered out, and the heavy oak door closed behind us with a definitive, final thud. The sudden return to the bustling corridor was jarring. The air, which moments before had been still and tense, now swirled with the sounds of commerce and the scent of prosperity. As we descended towards the street, that cheerful hum seemed to mock the cold indifference we had just faced. "Well, Holmes, that was a dead end if ever there was one. The man is a veritable fortress," asked Dr. John Watson. "On the contrary, Watson," he replied, a glint in his eye. "A fortress that protests its strength too loudly is often concealing a breach. Mr. Grantham is not merely unconcerned, he is afraid. And fear, my dear fellow, is the most eloquent of confessions," Sherlock Holmes noted. Despite his optimism, I felt a profound sense of discouragement. The man's callous dismissal of the suffering of his employees grated on me, and the wall he had erected seemed insurmountable. My thoughts turned to Mrs. Hudson's invitation to her suffragist salon that evening. Surely an assembly of intelligent, forward-thinking women would offer a more enlightened perspective than the Emperor of Knightsbridge had just afforded us. I returned to Baker Street that evening in a foul humour, the condescending pronouncements of Mr. Josiah Grantham still ringing in my ears. Holmes was, as is his custom when a case is afoot, absent, likely prowling the less salubrious corners of the city in one of his many disguises. Upon my writing desk, however, lay a note in Mrs. Hudson's neat, determined hand, inviting me to a gathering in her own drawing-room. It was, she had informed me some weeks prior, her intention to host a small salon for ladies of a progressive inclination. Weary of my own company and the lingering scent of Grantham's pomade in my memory, I descended the 17 steps with a sigh. The scene that greeted me was a far cry from the quiet domesticity of our landlady's quarters. The room was abuzz with the low, earnest hum of intelligent conversation, punctuated by the delicate clink of porcelain teacups. The air, thick with the scent of beeswax and Earl Grey, seemed charged with intellectual energy. Mrs. Hudson, seeing me at the threshold, approached with a smile that contained a new and formidable confidence. "Dr. Watson, how good of you to join us. Do come in. I believe you are acquainted with Mrs. Ainsworth." Mrs. Hudson replied. She gestured towards a familiar figure, a lady of means and considerable character, whom Holmes and I had assisted in a trifling matter concerning a stolen pearl necklace some years ago. Mrs. Eleanor Ainsworth rose to greet me, her expression one of genuine warmth. "Doctor, a pleasure. I was just telling the ladies that I had heard Mr. Holmes was interesting himself in a matter at Harrods. A most unpleasant business, if the whispers are to be believed," said Mrs. Eleanor Ainsworth. At her words, the nearby conversation subsided, and several pairs of keen eyes turned towards me. It was in that moment, faced with this committee of astute and concerned women, that I felt a profound sense of my duty as a chronicler. These were not the fainting, hysterical creatures of Mr. Grantham's imagination. These were the very minds and hearts of a changing London, and their perspective on this case was not merely incidental, but essential. I found myself recounting our interview with the general manager, my voice perhaps a shade more indignant than I intended. He dismissed the entire affair as an outbreak of feminine vapours. He would not hear a word against the perfection of his establishment, and considered our presence an affront to his good name, asked Dr. John Watson. A murmur of disapproval went through the room. It was then that a calm, clear voice cut through the general discontent. Mrs. Hudson made the introduction. "This is Dr. Helena Worthington. She has been kind enough to lend us her expertise," remarked Mrs. Hudson. Dr. Worthington was a woman of about 40, with intelligent grey eyes and an air of quiet professionalism. She looked at me directly, her gaze analytical. "Dr. Watson, forgive my directness, but this diagnosis of hysteria is a convenient label for any ailment in a woman which a man cannot be bothered to investigate. Could you describe the symptoms you have observed?" remarked Dr. Helena Worthington. The room fell into a deep silence, the only sound the soft crackle of the fire in the hearth. I listed what Clara Perkins had told us: the persistent headaches, the nausea, the fatigue, and most particularly a slight but noticeable tremor in the hands. Dr. Worthington listened without interruption, her expression thoughtful. When I had finished, she did not hesitate. Her voice was steady, imbued with the certainty of scientific fact. "Hysteria does not present with such uniformity. It is a malady of the individual mind, its symptoms as varied as the patients themselves. But a consistent pattern of physical ailments across a dozen healthy young women points not to the mind, but to the environment. Headaches, nausea, tremors, these are not the signs of feminine fancy, doctor. They are the classic textbook symptoms of chronic low-level poisoning, most likely an arsenical or lead-based compound absorbed over a period of weeks." Dr. Helena Worthington answered. A collective gasp, sharp and horrified, went through the room. The word poison hung in the air, transforming a simple workplace complaint into something truly sinister. I saw the expression on Mrs. Ainsworth's face harden from concern into cold, resolute anger. Her teacup came to rest on its saucer with a decisive click. Mr. Grantham may be the emperor of his little kingdom, but he is also a tradesman, and I, ladies, am a very good customer. His obstinacy will not be permitted to endanger the lives of his staff. He will find that my patronage has a price, said Mrs. Eleanor Ainsworth. I left the salon that night with my head spinning, not from the tea, but from the stark clarity Dr. Worthington had provided. The case had taken a darker and far more urgent turn. An unseen poisoner was at work within the glittering halls of Harrods, and we had just gained a most formidable and unexpected ally in our quest to unmask them. Dr. Worthington's stark diagnosis, not hysteria, but poison, had lent a grim new urgency to our task. The very next morning, a damp fog clinging to the London streets, Holmes and I stood before the grand facade of Harrods. The great terracotta edifice rose before us, a world unto itself, its vast plate-glass windows gleaming like the eyes of some placid commercial beast. From within we could discern the low and constant hum of activity, the polite murmur of patrons, the distant ring of a cash register, and the soft rustle of expensive fabrics. Our previous attempts at inquiry were met with a wall of corporate platitude. This time, however, we have an ally, explained Sherlock Holmes. He said this with a faint, almost imperceptible smile, just as a handsome carriage drew up to the curb. From it emerged Mrs. Eleanor Ainsworth, a vision of resolute dignity in dark silk. She greeted us not with surprise, but with the quiet confidence of a co-conspirator. "Mr. Holmes, your telegram was most compelling. The notion that these girls are being dismissed so callously is an affront. Mr. Grantham will see us. I have insisted upon it," responded Mrs. Eleanor Ainsworth. The general manager's office was an opulent chamber of polished mahogany and thick carpet that deadened our footfalls. Mr. Josiah Grantham, a man whose stiff collar seemed a perfect extension of his rigid demeanour, rose to meet us. His expression was one of profound irritation. "Mrs. Ainsworth, you are one of our most valued customers, but this is highly irregular. I have already stated that the matter of the staff's delicate constitutions is being handled internally," Mr. Josiah Grantham replied. "And I have stated, Josiah, that my custom is conditional upon the welfare of those who serve me. Mr. Holmes is here at my behest. He will be given whatever access he requires," remarked Mrs. Eleanor Ainsworth. Her voice, though perfectly level, carried an undeniable authority that made the manager flinch. Grantham's gaze flickered between the formidable lady and the cool, appraising stare of my friend. Holmes had remained silent, his hands clasped behind his back, observing the room with an unnerving intensity. "Your concern is for the store's reputation, Mr. Grantham, an admirable, if misplaced, priority. I note the faint scent of carbolic in this room, yet the polish on your desk is beeswax. It suggests a recent vigorous cleaning in a specific area, perhaps to remove a spillage. You are a man who appreciates the containment of problems. Allow me to contain this one before it spills into the public ledger," Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. A muscle began to twitch in Grantham's jaw. Holmes's seemingly wild conjecture, as it appeared to me, had evidently struck a vital mark. The manager's bluster vanished, deflating into a grudging acquiescence as he gestured stiffly towards the door. "Very well, but any disruption will be laid at your door, madam, and yours, sir. What is it you wish to see?" Mr. Josiah Grantham replied, "Everything your shopgirls touch. Their counters, their lockers, their staff rooms, and most particularly, Mr. Grantham, the place where they take their tea," declared Sherlock Holmes. As we followed the defeated manager from the room, Holmes caught my eye with an expression of grim satisfaction. He had forced the door open, so to speak, but I knew the most critical part of our investigation lay ahead. We had gained access, but we still lacked the definitive proof, the physical evidence of the poison that was so methodically sickening the women of Harrods. A persistent November drizzle wept against the windows of 221B Baker Street, blurring the gaslights of the world outside into indistinct golden smudges. Within, however, all was sharp focus. Holmes had converted a corner of our sitting room into a veritable laboratory, the air thick with the acrid tang of chemicals that warred with the familiar scent of his strong shag tobacco. He stood hunched over his table, a gaunt silhouette against the flickering blue flame of a Bunsen burner, arranging a series of glass pipettes with the delicate precision of a surgeon. We waited in quiet anticipation, awaiting the fruits of Mrs. Ainsworth's intervention. A soft, hesitant rap upon our door, quite distinct from the usual confident summons of a client, broke the silence. Holmes straightened at once, his head cocked like a hunting dog on the scent. "That will be our young confederate. Watson, if you would be so good," declared Sherlock Holmes. I admitted Miss Clara Perkins, her face pale and her bonnet damp with rain. She clutched a large cloth-wrapped parcel to her chest as if it were a precious infant. Her eyes darted nervously from me to the formidable figure of my friend, who had remained by his chemical table. "Mr. Holmes, I have them. It was not easy. Mr. Grantham has eyes everywhere," answered Miss Clara Perkins. Her voice was a strained whisper, barely audible above the hiss of the gas lamp. Holmes gestured towards the main table with a sweep of his long, thin hand. "You have done admirably, Miss Perkins. Your courage will not be forgotten. Place them here, if you please," remarked Sherlock Holmes. With trembling fingers, she unwrapped the bundle. Inside, nestled in the folds of a worn linen tablecloth, lay 4 porcelain teacups, each bearing the elegant green and gold crest of Harrods. They seemed innocuous, yet I knew they represented the very heart of our grim puzzle. Holmes picked one up, his long fingers turning it over under the lamplight. He did not look inside, but rather examined the glaze, the handle, the fine rim. "These were used yesterday by Mary, Alice, and myself. The 4th was used by Miss Evans, who was taken ill this morning. I took them from the trolley before they could be washed," answered Miss Clara Perkins. "Excellent. Your observational powers are first-rate. Now you must return before your absence is noted. Leave the rest to me," stated Sherlock Holmes. After seeing the brave young woman out, the sound of her light footsteps fading down the familiar 17 stairs, I returned to find Holmes already at his work. He had carried the cups to his corner and was peering into each one through a large magnifying lens. A deep silence fell over the room, broken only by the gentle clink of porcelain against his wooden worktop and the steady patter of the rain. Ah, Watson, come and see. The eye of the layman would dismiss this as mere dregs, the residue of sugar, perhaps. But look closer, observed Sherlock Holmes. I leaned over his shoulder. At the very bottom of the cup, where the last of the cold tea would have settled, I could discern a faint, almost imperceptible glittering. It was not the coarse grain of sugar, but a fine, crystalline powder, like frost on a window-pane. "Good heavens, Holmes, what is it?" Dr. John Watson inquired. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he took up a clean glass rod and carefully scraped a minuscule sample from the bottom of the cup. Then he lifted the porcelain to his nose, inhaling deeply. His expression, which had been one of intense concentration, hardened into one of grim certainty. "There is a scent, faint but unmistakable. Bitter, with an undertone not unlike almonds, yet sharper. It is a poison, Watson, administered in small, repeated doses with a truly devilish subtlety," stated Sherlock Holmes. He held the cup out to me, but I recoiled instinctively. The sight of that elegant piece of porcelain, now imbued with such malevolent purpose, sent a chill down my spine. Holmes merely smiled, a thin, grim line on his lips, and turned back to his array of glass and flame. "The nature of the substance is not a mystery to chemistry. A few tests will confirm its identity beyond all doubt. The true problem, my dear fellow, is not what it is, but how it came to be in these cups alone," remarked Sherlock Holmes. The following morning broke grey and damp. The windows of our sitting-room at 221B Baker Street streaked with the city's perpetual drizzle. The familiar scent of Mrs. Hudson's frying bacon was quite overpowered by a sharper, more acrid odour emanating from the corner where Holmes had established his makeshift laboratory. He was hunched over his chemical table, a delicate glass pipette in hand, his entire being focused upon the porcelain teacups Miss Perkins had diligently procured for us. The only sounds were the gentle hiss of a Bunsen burner and the rhythmic tick of the mantelpiece clock. I had long since finished my breakfast and the morning paper, and was watching him with a familiar mixture of patience and curiosity. At last he straightened up, placing the pipette carefully upon its rack. A faint clink of glass against wood was the only signal that his work was complete. He turned towards me, and in the grey morning light his eyes held a familiar, triumphant gleam. "The residue, Watson, is not at all exotic. On the contrary, it is remarkably commonplace." "You have identified it, then?" Dr. John Watson inquired. "I have. It is oxalic acid, a crystalline powder, soluble in water, and frequently employed in the less glamorous but essential tasks of polishing brass and removing ink stains. A substance one might find in any large establishment's cleaning supply cupboard," Sherlock Holmes pointed out. He picked up one of the tainted cups, holding it to the light. The fire crackled in the grate, casting flickering shadows across his hawk-like features as he spoke. "But it is the dosage that proves most instructive. The quantity in each cup is minute, Watson, far too little to prove fatal. A larger amount would cause a swift and agonizing end, but these doses, these are designed for a different purpose entirely," Sherlock Holmes pointed out. He set the cup down and began to pace before the hearth, his hands clasped behind his back. The floorboards creaked softly under his measured tread. "Consider the symptoms the young women described. Acute gastric pain, yes, but also muscular tremors and a persistent draining weakness. It is a state of perpetual malaise. This is not murder, my dear fellow. This is torment. A systematic campaign to render these ladies unwell, to make their working lives an unbearable misery. Good heavens, Holmes, but how could the poisoner ensure only certain individuals were affected? If the acid is in the tea, surely all who drank from the pot would fall ill, Dr. John Watson added. Holmes stopped his pacing and fixed me with a sharp, analytical stare. A smile played upon his thin lips. An excellent and obvious objection, which is precisely why the poison is not in the tea at all, Sherlock Holmes pointed out. He paused for effect, allowing the implication to settle in the quiet room. The acid is delivered via a medium that can be individually targeted. Something served alongside the tea, offered to one but not another. Think, Watson, what is the constant companion to an afternoon cup of tea in a place such as Harrods? A biscuit, perhaps, or a small cake, Dr. John Watson replied. Precisely. A single biscuit. A pinch of this white powder, almost indistinguishable from sugar, could be dabbed upon its surface moments before serving. An elegant, simple, and devilishly effective method of delivery. The culprit is not poisoning the pot, they are poisoning the plate. The sheer cunning of the method was chilling. It spoke of a perpetrator who was close at hand, moving amongst the victims with impunity. A distant rumble of a heavy dray cart from the street below seemed to punctuate the gravity of his discovery. Our task, therefore, has clarified. We seek an individual with access to cleaning supplies, a deep-seated grudge against these specific shopgirls, and the opportunity to interfere with the tea service. The field of suspects, while still within the store's walls, has narrowed considerably. The theory of the poisoned biscuit, elegant as it was, left us in a frustrating state of inaction. Holmes paced our sitting room at 221B Baker Street, the floorboards groaning with his restless energy. Outside, the afternoon fog thickened, muffling the clatter of hooves to a dull beat. For 2 days we had heard nothing from our confederates at Harrods, and the waiting had worn my friend's patience to a thread. It is the timeline that vexes me, Watson. The poisoner is methodical, yet the attacks appear sporadic. There is a logic at play which we have not yet grasped, replied Sherlock Holmes. He stopped before the mantelpiece, plucking a telegram from the stack of correspondence. As his eyes scanned it, a flicker of something, not quite satisfaction, but perhaps professional interest, crossed his features. Ah, a missive from the estimable Lestrade. Scotland Yard, in its typically lumbering fashion, has produced a suspect. It seems a groundskeeper, one Silas Finch, was dismissed from his post at the store a fortnight ago, observed Sherlock Holmes. A disgruntled employee? Good heavens, Holmes, that seems a most promising lead. Did he have access? Commented Dr. John Watson. Indeed. Lestrade proudly reports that Finch oversaw the store's cleaning agents, including the oxalic acid used for polishing brass. He was dismissed for insolence and was heard threatening the general manager upon his departure. The police believe they have their man, replied Sherlock Holmes. My hopes soared. A clear motive, the means readily at hand. It was the very picture of a straightforward case. Yet Holmes's expression remained unconvinced. He tossed the telegram onto the table and reached for his coat. "Come, Watson, the air in this room is stale with conjecture. Let us take a constitutional and see if the world outside offers more clarity." Our walk took us, not coincidentally, to the warren of service alleys behind Harrods' grand facade. The air was thick with coal smoke and boiled cabbage. A steady drip from a rusted pipe echoed in the narrow passage, a counterpoint to the distant rumble of a drayman's cart. Holmes, without announcing his purpose, steered us towards a grimy public house from which coarse laughter spilled into the street. He exchanged a few words and a shilling with a match-boy, who pointed a grimy finger towards a stooped figure nursing a pint of ale near the door. "That is our Mr. Finch. Observe the resentful set of his jaw, the bitterness in his eyes. He is every inch the aggrieved party Lestrade described," stated Sherlock Holmes. We did not approach the man. After a few moments of silent observation, Holmes turned on his heel, and we made our way back towards Baker Street, the sounds of the alley fading. Back in our rooms, the gaslight hissed against the growing dark. Holmes retrieved a small annotated chart from his desk, the timeline of symptoms provided by Miss Perkins. Lestrade has found a villain, but not the villain of this particular piece. "Look here, Watson," explained Sherlock Holmes. His long, thin finger tapped a date on the paper, and I leaned closer to see. "The first young lady to fall ill, Miss Evans in haberdashery, reported her symptoms on the 3rd of this month. Others followed on the 4th and 5th. Now my source in the alley, far more reliable than any constable, confirms Silas Finch was dismissed on the 8th. He was still polishing the store's brasswork 5 days after our poisoner began his insidious work." "Then he cannot be the man," Dr. John Watson replied. His voice was low and decisive. "He is a classic red herring, Watson, a convenient scapegoat to save the authorities the trouble of actual thought. The official inquiry will chase this poor fellow, while the true culprit continues their work unimpeded," explained Sherlock Holmes. He folded the chart with an air of finality. The fire had sunk to a low glow, and the room felt suddenly colder. The most obvious path had proven to be a dead end. No, our mystery is not one of crude revenge from a dismissed groundskeeper. It is quieter, more personal. The solution lies not in the service alleys, but in the staff commissary. It is in the ritual of the tea, Watson. We must return to the biscuit. The dismissal of the disgruntled groundskeeper had left a palpable void in our investigation. Holmes sank back into his armchair, the brief flicker of excitement extinguished as he stared into the fire's heart. Outside, a persistent November drizzle whispered against the panes, and the mantel clock's rhythmic ticking measured the slow pace of our stalled inquiry. I had returned to my medical journals, though my eyes were drawn more to my friend's contemplative stillness than to the printed page. "It is the delivery, Watson. The method of administration eludes me. A shared teapot would be indiscriminate, yet the victims are chosen with deliberate care. It is a poisoner of remarkable precision," deduced Sherlock Holmes. He spoke to the flames more than to me, his voice a low murmur. Before I could offer some inadequate reply, a frantic, breathless rapping shattered the quiet at our door. Not the confident knock of a client, but an urgent summons. Holmes's head lifted, his eyes instantly alert. A moment later, Mrs. Hudson ushered in a rain-spattered and anxious Miss Clara Perkins. "Mr. Holmes, forgive the intrusion. I came as soon as I could. We have observed something of consequence," responded Miss Clara Perkins. She stood panting just inside the room, her bonnet askew and her cheeks flushed from haste. Holmes rose in a single fluid motion. His lethargy vanished as if it had never been. "Pray compose yourself, Miss Perkins, and tell us everything. Your observations have been the one steady light in this entire affair," Sherlock Holmes pointed out. The young woman drew a steadying breath, fixing an earnest gaze upon my friend. "It is the afternoon tea. We all receive it, as we told you. But we watched more closely, as you instructed. Mrs. Gable, the head of the commissary, serves the tea herself from the trolley. But for the girls who fell ill, she did something particular. She offered them a biscuit," replied Miss Clara Perkins. "A biscuit? But surely others take them," Dr. John Watson replied. "Ah, but that is the point, Doctor. There is a large plate of plain biscuits for everyone. But Mrs. Gable keeps a small private tin, a silver one, for herself. It is from this tin that she takes a single biscuit and places it with her own hands upon the saucer of the intended girl. We have confirmed it with 3 of the victims. None of the other staff were ever offered one from that specific tin," replied Miss Clara Perkins. A profound silence descended upon the room, broken only by the fire's hiss. A brilliant, fierce light dawned in Holmes's eyes. He took a sharp step forward, clasping his hands behind his back. "A separate tin! My dear Miss Perkins, you have handed me the key. Watson, do you not see the sublime simplicity of it? The oxalic acid we suspect is a crystalline powder, not unlike a dusting of sugar. One need not poison the whole pot, nor even a whole plate. One need only dust a single tempting biscuit," declared Sherlock Holmes. He began to pace before the hearth, his energy a stark contrast to his earlier languor, the scrape of his leather shoes on the rug the only sound for a moment. "It is targeted, direct, and leaves almost no trace. The delivery mechanism is solved. The culprit's action is pinpointed. We no longer look for a phantom in the tea-room. We look directly at Mrs. Gable and the silver biscuit tin in her hand," stated Sherlock Holmes. He stopped his pacing and turned back to the young shopgirl, his expression filled with immense respect. "Your sisterhood has done more than Scotland Yard could in a month. Now I have another task for you, one of even greater importance. We have the how, but we lack the why. I need you to uncover the motive. Talk to your colleagues. Learn everything you can of Mrs. Gable's history, her temperament, her resentments. We must understand the reason for this petty, vicious tyranny," explained Sherlock Holmes. The November rain lashed against our windows at 221B Baker Street, each gust of wind rattling the frames as if demanding entry. Inside, however, a profound stillness had fallen, broken only by the soft crackle of the hearth-fire. Before us sat Miss Clara Perkins, her bonnet laid aside, the damp chill of the evening still clinging to her coat. She had arrived not 10 minutes prior, her face pale, but her eyes alight with a grim sort of purpose. "You have succeeded, Miss Perkins. I see it in the firm set of your jaw. Pray, tell us what the sisterhood has uncovered," replied Sherlock Holmes. Holmes had not moved from his armchair, yet his entire being seemed to lean forward, a study in focused intensity. Miss Perkins took a steadying breath, her voice low and urgent when she finally spoke. "We have, Mr. Holmes. It was as you suspected. Once we began to ask, the stories came flooding out. Not all at once, mind you. Many of the girls are terrified of losing their positions. But in hushed tones, in the linen closets and the staff passages, they spoke of Mrs. Gable," replied Miss Clara Perkins. She described a campaign of quiet cruelty. A spilled inkwell here, a misplaced order book there. Small torments, always directed at the younger, more ambitious girls, and always deniable. The malevolence was clear, but the proof remained gossamer thin, until a junior kitchen hand provided the key. Her name is Mary, a timid girl, but honest. She was in the pantry a month ago, the very day it was announced that Eleanor Vance, one of the first to fall ill, had been given charge of the new hosiery counter. It was a promotion Mrs. Gable had publicly coveted. Miss Clara Perkins replied. "And what did this Mary witness?" asked Dr. John Watson. My question was quiet, yet it seemed to echo in the room. Miss Perkins's hands tightened in her lap. She saw Mrs. Gable corner Eleanor. Her voice, Mary said, was like ice. She berated her for reading a book on her lunch break, a book on modern commerce. Her words were precise. "Mark my words, girl. All this reading of books above your station will bring you nothing but ruin. It fills a woman's head with useless notions." Then, with a sudden shove, she sent a tray of pastries tumbling to the floor, remarked Miss Clara Perkins. A log shifted in the fireplace, sending a shower of sparks up the flue. Without a word, Holmes rose from his chair and began to pace, his long, thin shadow dancing upon the wall. And there we have it. The motive, Watson, is not one of grand avarice, but of curdled pride. A petty tyrant, ruling her small fiefdom of the staff commissary, sees the world changing around her. She sees these young women armed with education and ambition, and she does not see progress. She sees a threat, Sherlock Holmes noted. He stopped before the window, staring out at the blurred gaslights of the street below. His voice, when he continued, was hard as flint. She was passed over for a promotion in favor of a younger, brighter mind. Her bitterness, left to fester, required an outlet. It was only a matter of time before it found a tangible form. She could not strike at the management that slighted her, so she struck at the symbols of her perceived obsolescence, the educated shopgirls. "So it is her, you are certain," replied Miss Clara Perkins. Holmes turned from the window, and for the first time that evening a thin, dangerous smile touched his lips. The hunt was nearing its end. "Miss Perkins, your sisterhood has forged the links of motive with impeccable strength. We already possess the links of method. The chain is complete. All that remains is to persuade Mrs. Gable to fasten it about her own neck," stated Sherlock Holmes. The papers detailing the sisterhood's interviews lay spread across our table like a damning mosaic. Outside, the November drizzle had begun in earnest, its persistent patter against the window panes a dreary accompaniment to the crackle and hiss of our hearth fire. Miss Perkins sat perched on the edge of her chair, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white, whilst the elegant Mrs. Ainsworth regarded my friend with unwavering attention. Holmes himself had been silent for a quarter of an hour, his long fingers steepled before him, his gaze fixed upon the flickering flames. The only sound from his quarter was the occasional soft tap of one fingertip against another. At last he rose with a sudden, fluid motion that belied his pensive stillness. Her motive is not grand larceny, nor is it a crime of passion in the conventional sense. It is the slow, curdling poison of resentment. A petty tyrant, cornered by the advance of a new generation she cannot comprehend, has resorted to the weapons of the weak, whispers, sabotage, and now chemistry. Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. His voice, low and resonant, held the quiet authority of a lecturer laying bare an undeniable truth. He began to pace before the fireplace, his slippered feet making no sound upon the thick rug. To catch such a creature, we cannot use a net woven for lions. We must employ a snare designed for a field mouse. We must apply pressure not to her conscience, for she has little, but to her routine and her terror of exposure, Sherlock Holmes pointed out. "And how do you propose we do that, Mr. Holmes?" replied Mrs. Eleanor Ainsworth. Holmes stopped his pacing and turned, his grey eyes alight with a familiar predatory gleam that I knew so well. I recognized it at once. The look he wore when the game was truly afoot. "With a rumour, Mrs. Ainsworth, a carefully planted and altogether plausible rumour. You, madam, are known for your philanthropic interest in the welfare of working women. Tomorrow morning you will pay a visit to Mr. Josiah Grantham at Harrods. You will express grave, confidential concern over what you have heard regarding the health of his staff," replied Sherlock Holmes. "But Grantham will dismiss her out of hand," remarked Dr. John Watson. "Initially, yes, but Mrs. Ainsworth will then inform him with the utmost gravity that she has taken the liberty of engaging a renowned physician to conduct a surprise inspection of the staff's facilities and provisions. The inspection, she will state, is to occur the very next day," replied Sherlock Holmes. A flicker of understanding crossed Mrs. Ainsworth's features. She nodded slowly, the cogs of the plan turning visibly in her sharp mind. "The threat of public scrutiny from a person of influence. It will force his hand, and the news will spread through the staff like wildfire," answered Mrs. Eleanor Ainsworth. "Precisely. And our culprit, hearing that all provisions will be examined, will panic. She cannot risk the tainted items being discovered. She will be forced to retrieve and dispose of her handiwork before this fictitious doctor arrives. And we, of course, will be waiting to observe her," Sherlock Holmes pointed out. He turned his sharp gaze upon the young shopgirl. "Miss Perkins, there is one final critical detail. Tell me, on which day are the particular biscuits, the ones so often associated with these spells of illness, served to the staff?" Sherlock Holmes responded. Her voice trembled slightly as she replied, but her gaze held firm. "On Wednesdays, sir, always on Wednesdays. Tomorrow is Wednesday," Miss Clara Perkins said. A thin, grim smile touched Holmes's lips. The trap was perfectly designed, the bait exquisitely chosen. As our guests prepared to depart, the mantel clock began to chime the hour, each resonant strike counting down the moments until our poisoner's desperate final act. The alleyway behind Harrods was a chasm of brick and shadow, smelling faintly of damp coal dust and discarded vegetable matter. From our vantage point in a darkened doorway opposite, the great store presented a facade of serene indifference. Yet within its walls, the drama we had so carefully devised was now poised for its climax. Inspector Lestrade, shifting his considerable weight from one foot to the other, made the faint sound of leather creaking on stone. His voice was a low grumble, barely disturbing the evening air. "Are you certain of this, Holmes? It feels a dashed peculiar way to catch a poisoner, by rumour and suggestion," Inspector Lestrade answered. "Certainty, my dear Inspector, is a luxury. Probability, however, is a scientific tool. The guilty mind, when pressed by the fear of discovery, is the most predictable instrument in the criminal orchestra. It will invariably seek to rid itself of the incriminating evidence at the first sign of danger," replied Sherlock Holmes. Holmes stood perfectly still, a silhouette of focused patience, his gaze fixed upon a small, grimy window on the second floor, the window to the staff commissary. He had instructed Margaret, Lestrade's own daughter, to simply raise the sash a few inches the moment our quarry made her move. It was a simple signal, yet upon it hung the entire enterprise. The minutes stretched, each one the taut string, punctuated only by the distant clop of a horse-drawn cab and the low murmur of the city. Then it happened. The window sash slid upwards with a faint, dry squeak. It was a barely perceptible motion against the darkening brick, but to our strained senses it was as loud as a pistol shot. His voice was suddenly sharp, stripped of all languor. "Now, gentlemen, the performance begins," Sherlock Holmes said. We moved as one, crossing the narrow alley. A heavy wooden door, used for deliveries and staff, burst open, and a figure emerged, cloaked and hunched. It was Mrs. Gable. She scurried into the darkness, clutching a small biscuit tin to her chest. Her footsteps were a frantic, panicked tattoo on the paving stones. She did not see us until it was too late. Lestrade's voice boomed, full of the authority of Scotland Yard. "Hold there, Mrs. Gable," Inspector Lestrade replied. With a strangled cry, she wheeled about. Her eyes were wide with terror in the gloom. In that instant she tried to hurl the tin into the deepest shadows, but another figure darted from the doorway behind her. It was Margaret Lestrade, her face pale but resolute. With a surprising quickness she caught the woman's arm, causing the biscuit tin to tumble to the ground with a dull clang. A small corked bottle fell from the woman's other hand, rolling to a stop near my boot. Her voice, though trembling slightly, was clear and steady. She was clearing her locker, father. She said she was taking home some leftover biscuits. Margaret Lestrade answered. Holmes bent low, his gaze piercing the gloom, as he examined the bottle without touching it. Then, with the toe of his boot, he nudged the biscuit tin, revealing the specially marked biscuits within. Oxalic acid, I believe, and the very biscuits intended for tomorrow's tea. A most efficient, if desperate, attempt to dispose of the evidence. You see, Watson, a guilty conscience does our work for us. It cannot bear the weight of its own secrets. Mrs. Gable gave a low moan and seemed to sag against the wall as Lestrade produced his handcuffs. The metallic click echoed sharply in the confines of the alley. The trap had not only been sprung, it had closed with perfect and undeniable finality. "Take her, Inspector," Holmes said, his tone now calm and businesslike. "I believe Mr. Grantham is awaiting a full explanation of these peculiar events in his establishment," declared Sherlock Holmes. We were assembled in Mr. Grantham's office, a chamber of polished mahogany and stern portraits that seemed to absorb all sound. Below us, the great store hummed with the life of a London afternoon, but here a heavy silence reigned, broken only by the solemn tick of a grand clock upon the mantelpiece. Mrs. Gable sat rigid in a leather chair, her face a mask of indignation, while young Miss Perkins stood near the window, a silent and resolute witness. Mr. Grantham, his usual bluster quite evaporated, paced before his desk, his footsteps a dull thud on the thick Persian rug. "For heaven's sake, Holmes, get on with it. You have my head of staff here under some wild accusation. This is a damnable business," Mr. Josiah Grantham said. Holmes, who had been idly examining a paperweight on the desk, now turned his keen gaze upon the manager. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet, yet carried an edge of cold steel that cut through the room's tension. "It is indeed a damnable business, Mr. Grantham, one founded not on grand passions, but on the quiet, corrosive power of resentment. The problem was never one of widespread contagion, but of meticulous, hateful selection. The victims, Miss Perkins, Miss Albright, and the others, what did they share? Youth, ambition, and your particular favour. They were the future of this establishment." Sherlock Holmes responded. He paused, and his eyes settled upon Mrs. Gable, who flinched as if struck. Her hands were clenched so tightly in her lap that the knuckles shone white. "And you, Mrs. Gable, represent its past. 30 years of service, yet you saw yourself being eclipsed. Each word of praise for a younger woman was a slight to you. Each promotion you did not receive was a fresh wound. You could not compete with their energy, so you chose to cripple it," replied Sherlock Holmes. "This is monstrous, an outrageous fantasy. You have no proof of such a thing," replied Mrs. Gable. Her voice, though sharp, was betrayed by a tremor of fear that ran through it. I confess, even I felt a momentary doubt at her vehemence. The accusation was, after all, built upon the most delicate of inferences. "Holmes, she is right to ask, what proof have you?" wondered Dr. John Watson. Holmes offered me the barest hint of a smile before turning his attention back to the desk. He reached into his coat and produced the small biscuit tin we had recovered in the alley, placing it upon the polished mahogany with a soft, definitive click. The poison, oxalic acid, was subtle. A small dose, enough to cause distress but not to kill, administered in a shared pot of tea or a communal biscuit. But you grew bolder. This tin, Mrs. Gable, was found in your possession. It contains biscuits laced with a significantly higher concentration of the substance. A parting gift, perhaps, for the girl you resented most of all. Your motive was not murder, but a prolonged and spiteful campaign of misery, born from a career that had soured into professional jealousy. Sherlock Holmes pointed out. The fight went out of her at once. The woman's rigid posture collapsed, and she seemed to shrink into her chair. A low, wretched sound escaped her lips, and when she finally looked up, her eyes burned with a terrible, defeated malice. They didn't deserve it, strutting about, so pleased with themselves. I gave my life to this place. My life! And for what? To be pushed aside by chattering girls who knew nothing of real work. Yes, I did it. I made them sick. I wanted them to feel as weary and overlooked as I have felt for 20 years. Mrs. Gable replied. Her confession hung in the air, ugly and absolute. Mr. Grantham stared, his face pale with shock, while Miss Perkins let out a quiet, shuddering breath. In that moment, the weighty tick of the clock seemed to be counting down the final seconds of Mrs. Gable's career, and indeed her freedom. For just then, from the corridor outside, came the sound of firm, approaching footsteps. The confession hung in the air of Mr. Grantham's opulent office, a miasma more toxic than any poison Mrs. Gable had concocted. It was a silence broken not by hysterics, but by the heavy, methodical tread of boots in the corridor. Inspector Lestrade entered, his expression a mixture of grim satisfaction and professional duty. The subsequent arrest was a quiet, almost perfunctory affair, the click of handcuffs a stark, metallic sound against the room's heavy silence. As the door closed with a solid thud behind the disgraced woman and the officers of the law, we who remained were left in a new and profound quiet. Mr. Grantham, who had presided over his commercial empire with an iron will, now seemed a man diminished, slumped behind his enormous mahogany desk. Mrs. Ainsworth, however, stood tall, her gaze fixed upon him, not with triumph, but with an unyielding expectation. Her voice was calm and measured, yet it carried across the room with the force of a judgment. The immediate danger is past, Mr. Grantham. The scandal, however, is just beginning to brew. Mrs. Eleanor Ainsworth replied. He looked up, his face pale, his tone raspy with disbelief. Scandal? I have apprehended a criminal within my own establishment. I have cooperated fully, remarked Mr. Josiah Grantham. You have ignored a pattern of illness and distress amongst your staff that was glaringly obvious to anyone who chose to look. Holmes interjected, his voice cutting like a surgeon's scalpel. The newspapers, I fancy, will be less interested in Mrs. Gable's motives than in the conditions which allowed her malice to flourish undetected. The story of the Harrods malady, dismissed as feminine hysteria, will make for a most compelling headline, stated Sherlock Holmes. Mr. Grantham flinched as if struck. He ran a hand over his face, the fight visibly draining from him. Beside me, Miss Perkins stood as still as a statue, a silent testament to the truth of Holmes's words. There is another path, she continued softly, one of reform, one that turns this near tragedy into a story of progress. A dispensary on site with a qualified nurse, a staff dining room that serves proper hot meals, a formal review of any and all employee grievances conducted by a committee that includes their own representatives. Responded Mrs. Eleanor Ainsworth. He stared at her, then at Holmes, and finally his eyes settled on Miss Perkins. He let out a long, slow breath, the sound of a man surrendering. These are substantial changes, Mr. Josiah Grantham replied. A healthy workforce is a productive one, sir. Loyalty is not a commodity to be purchased, but a dividend earned through investment in human dignity. It is, you must admit, a sound business principle, replied Sherlock Holmes. A long minute passed, marked only by the solemn tick of a grand clock on the mantelpiece. Finally, Grantham gave a stiff, formal nod. He straightened his shoulders, a flicker of his old authority returning, albeit tempered with a new-found sobriety. "Very well, it shall be done. All of it. All of it." His gaze fell again upon the young woman who had started this entire affair. "And you, Miss Perkins, you have shown initiative and an intelligence that has been overlooked." He cleared his throat, the sound gruff and awkward. "The new Welfare Committee will require a supervisor, someone to liaise between the staff and management. The position is yours if you will accept it. It comes with a considerable increase in salary," remarked Mr. Josiah Grantham. For the first time, Clara Perkins's composure wavered. A deep blush rose to her cheeks, but her voice, when it came, trembled only slightly. I accept, sir. Thank you," Miss Clara Perkins answered. As we took our leave and descended into the bustle of the great store, Holmes was uncharacteristically quiet. He had solved the crime, but here, in the promise of tangible change, was a resolution of a different sort. I looked back at the young woman, no longer just a shopgirl, but a force for reform within these hallowed halls. I knew then that the full story of this case could not be told without understanding her part in it. A part documented, I was certain, with the same precision and care she had applied to everything else. The final embers of the Piccadilly poisoner case had at last ceased to glow, leaving in their wake a quiet sense of justice achieved. Here, in the familiar and comforting chaos of our Baker Street lodgings, the November evening drew in. A steady drizzle whispered against the window panes, a soft counterpoint to the cheerful crackle of the fire in the grate. I sat at my writing desk, a formidable stack of papers before me, my own hurried notes, several letters penned in a graceful feminine hand, and a small leather-bound diary. Contemplating the papers before me, I recognized that my own recollections, though I trust them to be accurate, formed but a skeletal framework for the tale. The true substance, the very heart of the matter, lay within these documents penned by others. Miss Perkins's diary, filled with entries both mundane and profound, provided the texture my own chronicle would otherwise lack, weaving the daily fears and quiet observations of the shopgirls into a tapestry of evidence no detective could have fashioned alone. "A most unusual case file, is it not, Watson?" Sherlock Holmes noted. I looked up. Holmes had abandoned his chemical apparatus and now stood by the mantelpiece, his tall, gaunt figure silhouetted against the firelight. He had been watching me, a faint, contemplative smile playing upon his lips. "Unusual, Holmes? I should say it is unique. It feels less like my own work and more a curated collection of testimonies," responded Dr. John Watson. "Precisely, and that is its strength. The official reports will note the facts, the method of poison, the motive of greed and retribution, the culprit apprehended. But they will entirely miss the central truth of the affair," stated Sherlock Holmes. He gestured with the stem of his pipe towards the papers on my desk. The scent of shag tobacco briefly mingled with the smell of old paper and ink. "The key to this puzzle, my dear fellow, was not found in a footprint nor a cigar ash. It was found within the pages of that diary, and in the shared anxieties detailed in the letters of Mrs. Ainsworth. It was a crime committed against an unseen network of working women, and it was that very same network that brought about its undoing. Their testimony, penned in their own hands, provided a pattern of psychological distress and physical malaise that no single isolated report could ever convey. We merely supplied the logic, they supplied the evidence, Sherlock Holmes said. He spoke with a quiet intensity I had seldom heard from him, a tone that betrayed a deep and genuine respect. He saw not a collection of hysterical females, as Mr. Grantham once had, but a resilient, observant collective. Their courage was remarkable, to risk their livelihoods for one another. Dr. John Watson inquired, "It is a form of courage the world seldom acknowledges, Watson. Far easier to celebrate the charge of the cavalryman than the quiet defiance of the shopgirl." "See that you do it justice," replied Sherlock Holmes. With that he turned, picked up his violin, and the low, melancholic notes of some German lullaby began to fill the room, a final, thoughtful requiem for the case. My gaze returned to the papers before me. Holmes was right. This was more than a mere record of a crime. It was a testament. My task, I now fully understood, was not simply to recount the brilliance of my friend, but to serve as a faithful chronicler for those whose voices might otherwise be lost to the great indifferent roar of London. And I would not fail them.